Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and I have a beautiful bundle of fabrics, and this fabric line is from Riley Blake's Designs, and the fabric is called Daisy Fields. This is so cute. I did design a quilt to go around it. Now, we're not going to need all of these fat quarters, but it is nice to have some options. There are so many beautiful options with this fabric line. I will be using 3 yellow fat quarters, 4 blue fat quarters, 2 very dark blues, and 1 green. I will also be using 1.5 yards of a background fabric. But of course, you can use whatever fabrics you'd like. I'm going to be cutting the background fabric in a particular order, and that way I can save on fabric. In the description, I will attach these little handouts, and I like to use these for cutting and for marking. So H, G, E, C, and BB are all of this background fabric. So my first cut, I need to cut 3 widths of fabric at 2.5 inches. I need to sew these strips together and then cut 2 long strips at 2.5 inches by 50 inches. So I'm going to have a little bit left over. So I have those 2 strips cut at 50 inches. I'm going to mark them with H, and I have this long strip left over. We're going to save that for another cut. My next cut, I need 2 long strips. G piece is cut at 38.5 inches. So I have 2 of those and a little piece left over. Mark that and put it aside. So I have some little pieces building up. The next thing I'm going to cut is E. I stack all of my fabric right sides up, mark it, and I do have a little piece left over. The next cutting is block number C. I'm going to need 2.5 by 4.5 inch strips. And before I cut the strips, I try to see if I can get anything from these other strips. They all were 2.5 inches, so I just need to make them that 4.5 inches. I did end up with 6 pieces, but you might end up with a different amount. So I now have 6 pieces from the 48 that I need. So I'm going to continue cutting the strips and get 48 pieces at 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. I place them all right sides together and mark them. So we have H, G, E, C, and BB. That's all going to be cut out of this background fabric. From there, we're going to be able to just cut them as those little blocks say, and just place them right on top of the fabrics. It just helps keep us organized. Once we have all of these cut out, we're going to be able to start sewing the units together. With the 4 fat quarter blues, we did cut some 4-inch blocks and some 3-inch blocks. Those 3-inch blocks are going to match the 3-inch yellow blocks. And we're going to make half square triangles with these. So we're going to place those fabrics together, draw a line from corner to corner, stitch a scant 1/4 inch on each side, cut them apart, and then press them to the blue and square them up to 2.5 inches. Once these half square triangles are done, we're going to build a unit. We will need to make 48 of these little blocks. So we've already done the half square triangles, which will be here. The A block we already have cut out. So we do need to make this little unit. So I call it a DBB block. And we're going to make it from these, and it really is easy. The first thing we're going to do is match our dark pile and our light pile together and make half square triangles out of them. Place those right sides together, draw a line from corner to corner, stitch that scant 1/4 inch. Now we're going to be able to cut those apart. And I would recommend pressing to that dark side. These half square triangles, we are not going to trim them down, but we are going to match them with these extra blues that we have left. So from the 4 blue fat quarters, we did cut 12 4-inch squares. So we now have a total of 48 of these blocks. They're going to match with our 48 half square triangles. Now when we put them together, you're going to find that this 4-inch is bigger than that half square triangle. And that's fine. It was just easier to cut than an odd measurement. So we're going to place those right sides together and draw a line from point to point, crossing through that seam. So that bottom fabric can really fit anywhere, but we do want that line going down the center. So it's going to look like this. Same idea as a half square triangle. We've drawn that line. We're going to stitch on each side of that line. Once we've done that 2 rows of stitching, we get to cut this apart. And we have some fun magic that happens here. When we open up the block, we have the larger triangle, and then the 2 smaller triangles are opposite, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So this 1 unit will make 1 corner. We need to trim up these squares to 2.5 inches. There are a few different ways we can square these up, but they do need to be squared up to 2.5 inches. If you have a 2.5 inch square, you can use that. We do need the 2 corner pieces sitting on that seam and that top sitting on the 3rd seam. So we have 1 point in this seam and a point in that seam. So then we're going to be able to trim that down. Having that block a little bit of a generous size is going to make it just a little bit easier to trim down. So now we have that perfect 2.5 inch. If you do not have a 2.5 inch ruler, you can use any square ruler. The point is going to come up to the top, and if we count down 2.5 inches, that 2.5 inch mark should be on that seam. So you can envision that that's going to be a 2.5 inch square. So I have that point up at the top. That cross seam sits at the 2.5 inches. I can trim it. And now rotate that block and finish trimming at 2.5 inches. So we now have 2 identical, but the colors are opposite. And those cute little squares make up these 2 corners. So we have a blue, the dark blue, and a light. And for the other side, we have that light blue, the dark blue, and that background fabric. To finish this corner, we do need our A unit. I do have a whole stack of them, and those have already been pre-cut. I'll need that half square triangle we did right at the beginning. And what I would recommend is match it up with the same fabric. When you match it up with the same fabric and sew it together, this looks like one long piece. And we're going to need 48 of these little corners. So we can sew those 2 units together, sew these 2 units together, and then sew them down that center. If you don't want to match that corner, it's fine. It's still going to look nice with whatever you put there. I personally like that one long row. We now have 48 of those little corners done. You can really see where this looks like one piece. So we do end up with 12 of each of those blues. These are going to make blocks. So we're going to put those solid squares pointing to the outside. That background sea color that we cut will be divided up and put in between, and that AC is that little center. So we can sew the blocks so that we have all of the same colors on each corner. Or if you'd like, you could take the same fabric, so you will end up with 4 blocks with the same color. We could sew them in rows and then sew those rows together. So we will have 12 of these blocks, and the blocks will equal 10.5 inches. We now have 12 of these blocks. We're going to put them together in a quilt with rows of sashing. And in order to do that, we're going to start and take our e-pile and sew one piece on the bottom, another piece on the side, and a cornerstone. You will need 12 strips to match those 12 blocks for the right side, 12 strips with those cornerstones sewn on to match up along that bottom. We now have 12 of these blocks, and they're going to make our quilt. We're going to build a quilt with 3 blocks in each row, just by sliding those together. And we're going to need 4 rows. By adding those pieces, we've built in the sashing. So we have the sashing all the way around the bottom to the right side and the centers. So we're going to need to build the sashing on the sides and on the top. So along 4 blocks, we're going to add a sashing piece, a cornerstone, a sashing piece, a cornerstone, and we're going to do the same along the top. Once all of the sashing is stitched on, we're going to be able to sew those blocks together in rows and then put those rows together. So we now have the built-in sashing. The only thing that's going to be left are 4 cornerstones and the very first 2 things we cut, G and H. So we have the top and the bottom, the left and the right, and cornerstones are going to go in between. The quilt is now done. We did start cutting the background fabrics first, and the H, which was the very first thing we cut, was the very last thing we put on, which was the 2 sides. That built-in background sashing really does give it a fresh, clean look. And the blue points and those green cornerstones give it just that extra sparkle. The quilt is 42 inches by 54 inches, so it's a perfect size for our lap. Now, of course, this can be made in any fat quarters at all. Just add some of that background fabric to give it that fresh, clean look. I'll put a link in the description so you can have these handouts. And when you do go to print this out, be sure to print it out on a computer. A lot of times our phones and our tablets just will not print out PDFs. They read blank, and that's why we need to go to our computer. I do hope you enjoyed today's episode on this very pretty fabric called Daisy Fields. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and I do have a newsletter all under Sew Very Easy. I do hope you come back. Bye for now.